I've been a park ranger for 15 years. One discovery changed everything. Being a park ranger in the remote wilderness of Northern Idaho probably isn't what most people would consider an exciting career. But honestly, it suits me just fine. There's something peaceful about spending your days surrounded by towering pines, crystal clear mountain lakes, and wildlife that most people only see in nature documentaries. The pay isn't great, but the solitude and natural beauty more than make up for it. Clearwater National Forest covers over 1.8 million acres of pristine wilderness. It's the kind of place where you can hike for days without seeing another human soul. The park gets maybe 10,000 visitors a year, mostly during the brief summer season when the mountain passes are clear of snow. Most of them stick to the main trails near the visitor center. Very few venture into the backcountry, where I spend most of my time. My job involves routine maintenance of remote trails, wildlife monitoring, and the occasional search and rescue operation. In 15 years on the job, I've dealt with lost hikers, injured climbers, aggressive bears, and the odd poacher. Nothing too dramatic. The most excitement I usually see is when some city folk get turned around on what they thought was a simple day hike and end up spending an unexpected night in the woods. The ranger station where I'm based is about 40 miles from the nearest town, connected by a winding dirt road that becomes impassable during winter storms. There are only 3 of us assigned to this section of the forest. There's Marcus, a grizzled veteran who's been working these mountains for over 20 years. Then there's Sarah, a recent forestry graduate who joined us 2 years ago, full of enthusiasm and environmental science knowledge. And then there's me, David Collins, somewhere in the middle at 38 years old, with a decade and a half of experience under my belt. For the most part, we each patrol different sections of the forest, staying in radio contact and meeting back at the station every few days to resupply and file reports. It's a quiet, predictable routine that I've grown comfortable with over the years. The isolation doesn't bother me like it does some people. After growing up in crowded suburbs and spending 4 years in the military, I actually prefer the solitude. But there was one incident that happened 3 years ago that still gives me chills whenever I think about it. One discovery that made me question everything I thought I knew about these mountains. And after what happened last week, I can't keep it to myself anymore. It was early October, just as the first snow was beginning to dust the higher peaks. The tourist season was winding down, and most of the casual hikers had already headed home for the year. I was doing a final maintenance check on the remote trail system in the northern section of my patrol area, a rugged wilderness zone that sees maybe a dozen visitors all season. The trail I was following wound through dense stands of old-growth fir and cedar, some of them over 300 years old. It was the kind of forest that feels ancient, where the canopy is so thick that even at midday, everything has a greenish, filtered quality. Sound travels strangely in woods like that. Sometimes you'll hear a twig snap from what seems like miles away. Other times you won't notice a deer until it's practically stepping on your boots. I'd been hiking for about 6 hours when I reached Miller Creek, a small tributary that feeds into the main river system. The trail crossed the creek via a simple wooden bridge that I'd helped build 2 summers earlier. As I approached the bridge, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. There were scratches in the wood, deep parallel gouges that looked fresh. At first I assumed they were claw marks from a bear. Black bears and the occasional grizzly were common in this area, and they sometimes damaged trail infrastructure while foraging. But as I knelt down to examine the marks more closely, I realized they were unlike anything I'd ever seen. The scratches were too regular, too deliberately placed. They formed a pattern, almost like symbols or letters carved into the wood. More disturbing still, they appeared to have been made from underneath the bridge, as if something had been hanging below and clawing upward. The gouges went deep into the wood, deeper than any bear claw should have been able to penetrate. I took photos and made notes in my field journal, then radioed back to the station. Marcus answered, his voice crackling through the static. "Station to Ranger Collins. Go ahead." "Marcus, I'm at the Miller Creek Bridge. I've got some unusual damage here. Looks like something damaged the bridge from underneath. Deep claw marks, but the pattern is strange. Not like any animal damage I've seen before. There was a pause. Could be a wolverine. They're rare in this area, but not unheard of. Aggressive little creatures with claws that can tear through almost anything. I looked at the marks again. Maybe, but these seem too large for a wolverine, and too organized. There's definitely a pattern here. We'll document it and we'll file a report. Could be worth having the wildlife biologist take a look. You planning to head back tonight? I checked my watch. It was already past 4 in the afternoon, and I still had 3 miles of trail to check before reaching the turnaround point. Negative. I'll camp at Devil's Hollow tonight and finish the circuit tomorrow. Copy that. Weather forecast shows clear skies. Check in tomorrow morning. Will do. Collins out. I shouldered my pack and continued up the trail, but the strange marks on the bridge kept nagging at me. In all my years in the forest, I'd never seen anything quite like them. The deliberate nature of the scratches bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Devil's Hollow was a natural clearing, about 2 miles past the bridge, surrounded by towering pines, and featuring a small spring that provided clean drinking water. It was one of my favorite camping spots, remote enough that I'd never encountered another soul there, but comfortable and peaceful. I'd spent dozens of nights there over the years without incident. I set up my tent in the usual spot, built a small fire, and prepared a simple dinner of instant noodles and canned soup. As darkness fell, I sat by the fire making notes in my journal and listening to the familiar sounds of the forest at night. Owls hooting in the distance, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the occasional crack of a settling tree. All normal sounds that I'd grown accustomed to. But around midnight, I heard something that made my blood freeze. It was a sound I'd never heard before in all my years in the wilderness, a low rhythmic scraping noise that seemed to be coming from somewhere in the trees around my campsite. It would last for about 10 seconds, then stop for a minute or two, then start again. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam around the perimeter of the clearing, but I couldn't see anything beyond the usual tangle of undergrowth and tree trunks. The scraping stopped as soon as I turned on the light. I waited, listening intently, but heard nothing except the normal forest sounds. After about 20 minutes of silence, I convinced myself it must have been a porcupine or some other nocturnal animal going about its business. I banked the fire and retreated to my tent, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I started to doze off, I'd hear that scraping sound again, always just at the edge of perception, always stopping the moment I became fully alert. I must have finally fallen asleep around 3 in the morning, because I was awakened by my radio alarm at 6:30. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The forest was completely quiet, not even the usual morning bird calls. It was the kind of unnatural silence that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I unzipped my tent and looked around the campsite. Everything appeared normal at first glance. My gear was where I'd left it. The fire had burned down to cold ashes, and there was no sign of any animal intrusion. But as I stepped out of the tent, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were marks in the dirt around my campsite. Not footprints exactly, but long parallel gouges in the soft earth, similar to the scratches I'd found on the bridge. They formed a rough circle around where I'd slept, as if something had been prowling around my tent all night. I examined the marks more closely, my unease growing by the minute. Whatever had made them was large, much larger than any predator that should have been in this area. The gouges were deep and evenly spaced, suggesting claws of considerable size and strength. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to have been made by something moving in a deliberate, organized pattern, not the random wandering of a wild animal. I packed up my gear as quickly as possible and headed back toward the trail. Part of me wanted to abandon the rest of the maintenance circuit and return to the station immediately, but my professional training kept me focused on the job. I had responsibilities, and I wasn't about to let some strange scratches spook me into abandoning my duties. The remaining section of trail was in good condition, requiring only minor maintenance. I cleared a few fallen branches and repaired a damaged trail marker, but my mind kept wandering back to the mysterious marks. By the time I reached the end of the circuit, I'd almost convinced myself that I was overreacting. Large predators were known to investigate campsites, and the marks could have been made by a bear or mountain lion that was merely curious about the unusual scent of a human in its territory. But then I found the tree. It was about a mile from my campsite, just off the main trail in a small grove of ancient cedars. At first glance, it looked like any other tree in the forest, but as I passed by, something caught my eye. The bark on one side of the trunk was damaged, stripped away in long sections from about chest height all the way up to 12 feet off the ground. I'd seen plenty of trees damaged by bears. They'll sometimes claw at bark to mark territory or to get at insects underneath, but this was different. The damage was too extensive, too intense. It looked like something had marked the tree with incredible force, removing bark and gouging deep into the wood beneath. As I circled the tree, documenting the damage with my camera, I noticed something else. There were more of those strange symbols carved into the exposed wood, the same deliberate, organized pattern I'd seen on the bridge. This time, however, the marks were much clearer, and I could make out what almost looked like letters or numbers. I spent 20 minutes photographing the tree from every angle, taking detailed notes and GPS coordinates. Whatever had done this was unlike any animal I'd ever encountered. The height of the damage suggested something that could reach 12 feet off the ground. The pattern of the marks suggested intelligence, purpose, and the intensity of the marking suggested something that was either extremely territorial or extremely agitated. I radioed back to the station, but got no response. Not unusual in this part of the forest, where the radio range was limited by the mountainous terrain. I'd have to wait until I got back to base to report what I'd found. The hike back to the station took most of the day. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The woods felt different now, somehow more threatening. Every shadow could be hiding something, watching me. Every sound could be the approach of whatever had left those marks. I reached the station just as the sun was setting. Marcus was in the office, updating trail reports on his computer. He looked up as I entered, immediately noticing my expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Dave. Rough night." I dropped my pack and pulled out my camera. "Take a look at these photos. Tell me what you think." Marcus studied the images on the camera's small screen, his expression growing more serious with each photo. When he finished, he looked up at me with a frown. "These are from the Miller Creek area." "The bridge marks." "Yes, but I found more, a lot more. There's something moving around out there, Marcus. Something big." He leaned back in his chair. "Could be a Sasquatch enthusiast. You know, someone trying to create fake evidence for those cryptid hunter shows. We've had problems with that kind of thing before." I shook my head. "I've seen hoax evidence before. This is different. The damage is too extensive, too intense, and the marks were made from underneath the bridge. How would a human hang upside down under a bridge to carve symbols?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, studying the photos again. "What do you want to do?" "I think we need to report this to the district office. Get a wildlife biologist out here to examine the evidence, and maybe we should restrict access to that area until we know what we're dealing with." "Dave, you know how the district office feels about rangers who report unusual incidents. They'll think we're either incompetent or looking for attention, and restricting access to public land based on some scratches in the wood." He shook his head. "We need more evidence before we can take any official action." I knew he was right. The National Park Service had a strict policy about unsubstantiated reports of unusual wildlife activity. Too many rangers had hurt their careers by filing reports about things they couldn't prove. but I also knew that what I'd found was significant. What about Sarah? Has she reported anything unusual from her sector? She's been working the southern trails all week. Haven't heard anything out of the ordinary. Why don't you talk to her when she gets back tomorrow? I spent the rest of the evening reviewing the photos and organizing my notes. The more I studied the evidence, the more convinced I became that something significant was happening in the forest. The patterns were too consistent, too deliberate to be random animal behavior. Sarah returned to the station the next morning, tired, but in good spirits after a week of trail maintenance in the more populated southern section of the forest. She was a skilled ranger and had excellent instincts when it came to wildlife behavior. If anyone could help me make sense of what I'd found, it would be her. I showed her the photos and described my experience at Devil's Hollow. She listened intently, asking detailed questions about the size and depth of the marks, the pattern of the damage, and the location of each incident. "Have you considered that these might be territorial markers?" she asked, studying the bridge photos. Some large predators will mark their territory in specific ways to communicate with other animals. But the complexity of the patterns, the apparent intelligence behind them, I've never seen anything like this from any known species. She nodded thoughtfully. "What about the sounds you heard? Can you describe them more specifically?" I closed my eyes, trying to recall the exact quality of the scraping noise. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like something was dragging claws across wood or stone, and it seemed to respond to my presence. It would stop whenever I turned on my flashlight. That suggests awareness of human activity. Most wild animals would either flee completely or investigate more directly. This behavior pattern is unusual. Over the next few days, I found myself becoming obsessed with the mystery. I spent my off hours researching similar incidents, scouring online databases of wildlife reports and unusual animal behavior. I found scattered accounts of similar markings in other remote wilderness areas, but nothing conclusive. A week later, I received a radio call that would change everything. "Station to Ranger Collins. We have a situation. Missing hiker in your sector. Name is Jennifer Walsh, age 26, from Seattle. She was supposed to return from a solo backpacking trip 2 days ago. Her emergency contact just called it in." I grabbed my pack and headed out immediately. Search and rescue operations were always high priority, and every hour of delay could mean the difference between life and death. Jennifer's planned route took her through the Northern Trail system, including the area where I'd found the strange markings. The search took most of the day. I followed her intended route, looking for any sign of her passage. About 5 miles in, I found her campsite from the first night. Everything appeared normal, a properly constructed fire ring, no food left out to attract animals, gear stored appropriately. She'd clearly been an experienced backpacker who knew proper wilderness protocols, but there was no sign of her beyond that point. The trail continued for another 6 miles to a scenic overlook that was marked on her itinerary, but I found no evidence that she'd ever reached it. No footprints, no dropped items, no trace of her passage. As the sun began to set, I made the decision to camp at her site and continue the search at first light. I set up my tent in the same clearing she'd used, hoping that staying in the same location might reveal some clue about what had happened to her. Around midnight, I heard the scraping sound again, but this time it was much closer, and it was accompanied by something else, a low guttural vocalization that was unlike anything I'd ever heard in the forest. It wasn't quite a growl, not quite a howl, but something that seemed to combine elements of both. I grabbed my flashlight and emergency flare gun, my heart pounding. The sound was coming from the edge of the clearing, maybe 30 yards from my tent. As I swept the flashlight beam across the tree line, I caught a glimpse of something that made me freeze. 2 eyes, reflecting the light like mirrors, staring back at me from the darkness. They were too high off the ground to belong to any known predator, positioned at least 8 feet above the forest floor, and they were moving, swaying slightly, as if whatever they belonged to was shifting its weight from foot to foot. The scraping sound started again, and I realized I was hearing claws dragging across tree bark. Whatever was out there was marking the trees around my campsite, just as it had done at Devil's Hollow. I kept the light trained on those eyes, afraid to look away, afraid to make any sudden movements. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other across the clearing. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the presence vanished, the eyes disappeared, and the forest fell silent. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my tent with my back against a tree, flare gun in hand, listening to every sound in the forest. Just before dawn, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a human voice, calling out from somewhere in the darkness. "Help me, please. Someone help me." It was a woman's voice, weak and desperate. Jennifer Walsh. It had to be. I grabbed my gear and headed toward the sound, following it deeper into the forest. The voice continued to call out, always seeming to come from just ahead of me, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I followed the voice for over an hour, crashing through underbrush and scrambling over fallen logs. But no matter how far I went, I never seemed to get any closer to its source. And then, just as the first light of dawn was beginning to filter through the canopy, the voice stopped. I found myself standing in a small clearing I'd never seen before, surrounded by trees that had been stripped of their bark in the same intense manner I documented earlier. But this time, the damage was fresh. Sap was still oozing from the wounds in the wood, and the forest floor was covered with bark fragments and wood chips. In the center of the clearing, I found Jennifer Walsh's backpack. It was damaged, its contents scattered across the ground. Her sleeping bag was torn, her food containers were crushed, and her camping gear was bent and twisted as if it had been handled by something with incredible strength. But there was no sign of Jennifer herself. I radioed for backup and spent the rest of the day helping the search team scour the area. We found no trace of the missing hiker, no evidence of what had happened beyond the disturbed campsite. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. The official report listed Jennifer Walsh as a missing person. The disturbed campsite was attributed to a bear encounter, despite the lack of any bear tracks or typical bear behavior patterns. The case was closed within a week. But I knew better. I knew that whatever had taken Jennifer Walsh was the same thing that had been leaving those marks throughout the forest, and I knew that it was still out there, watching, waiting. Over the next 2 years, I documented 17 more incidents of unusual markings in the northern sector of the forest. Each time, the patterns were similar: deep claw marks in deliberate configurations, trees stripped of bark at impossible heights, and that same sense of being watched by something intelligent and mysterious. I also began to notice changes in the normal wildlife patterns. Areas that had once been rich with bird life fell silent. Deer trails that had been used for generations were abandoned. It was as if the animals were avoiding something, staying away from territories that had once been safe. Marcus retired last year and was replaced by a younger ranger named Tom Bradley. I tried to brief Tom on the situation, but he was skeptical of my reports and chalked up the markings to natural causes. Sarah was transferred to a different district after she started asking too many questions about the missing hiker case. I began to feel isolated, like I was the only one who understood the true nature of what was happening in the forest. The weight of that knowledge was starting to affect my job performance and my mental health. I considered requesting a transfer, but I also felt a responsibility to stay and monitor the situation. Then, last week, everything changed. I was doing a routine patrol of the northern trails when I came across a group of 3 hikers who were clearly lost. They were college students from Montana, inexperienced backpackers who had strayed off the main trail and were starting to panic as darkness approached. I guided them back to the main trail and was escorting them toward the trailhead When we heard it, that familiar scraping sound, but louder and more aggressive than I'd ever heard it before, the students stopped walking, looking around nervously. "What was that?" one of them asked. Before I could answer, we heard the vocalization, that same guttural, inhuman sound that I'd heard 2 years earlier. But this time, it was answered by another voice, and then another. There were at least 3 of them, positioned at different points around our location. The students were terrified, clustering together and looking to me for guidance. I drew my sidearm and activated my emergency beacon, but I knew that help was at least 2 hours away. We were on our own. "Stay close to me," I told them. "Don't run. Don't make any sudden movements. We're going to walk slowly toward the trailhead." We made it about 100 yards before they revealed themselves. Stepping out of the forest like shadows given form, 3 creatures unlike anything in the zoological record. They were tall, at least 9 feet in height, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb the moonlight. Their arms were disproportionately long, ending in hands that were more like claws, but it was their faces that will haunt me forever, almost human, but twisted into something predatory and alien. The students screamed and tried to run, but the creatures moved with impossible speed, cutting off their escape routes. One of them, the largest, approached me directly. Its eyes were intelligent, calculating. It tilted its head as if studying me, and I realized it recognized me. This was the same presence that had been watching me for 3 years. When it spoke, its voice was like gravel grinding against stone. "You have been watching us." The fact that it could speak, that it possessed language and intelligence, was more terrifying than any animal encounter could have been. This wasn't just a predator. It was something that could think, plan, and communicate. "Yes," I managed to say, "I've been documenting your presence." "You will stop. I can't do that. People need to know." The creature's expression changed, and I saw something that looked almost like amusement. "People will not believe." It was right, of course. Who would believe a story about intelligent, unknown creatures living in the deep forest? Without proof, without evidence, I would be dismissed as another ranger who had cracked under the pressure of isolation. "The girl," I said, thinking of Jennifer Walsh. "What happened to her?" The creature's head tilted again. "She is safe." I felt a chill run down my spine. Safe how? But the creature was already backing away, melting back into the forest shadows. Its companions followed, and within moments they had vanished completely. The students and I were alone again, shaking in the darkness. I escorted them out of the forest and filed a report describing a bear encounter that had frightened but not harmed the hikers. The students were too traumatized to give coherent statements, and their fragmented accounts of monsters were dismissed as panic-induced hallucinations. But I know what I saw. I know what's living in those mountains, hidden from the world in the deep wilderness where humans rarely venture. And I know that they're not just random predators. They're organized, intelligent, and they've been watching us as carefully as we've been watching them. The question that haunts me now is what they mean by safe. Are there other missing hikers out there? People who have been taken rather than harmed? And if so, what has become of them? I'm writing this account because I need people to know the truth, even if they don't believe it. There are things in the wilderness that science hasn't documented, things that challenge our understanding of the natural world. The forests are vast, and there are still places where ancient things might survive, hidden from human civilization. If you're planning to venture into remote wilderness areas, especially alone, please be careful. Stay on established trails, travel in groups, and trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, if you feel like you're being watched, don't dismiss those feelings as paranoia. And if you're ever hiking in Northern Idaho, in the Clearwater National Forest, and you hear a scraping sound in the darkness, don't investigate. Don't follow voices calling for help. Just leave as quickly and quietly as you can. because some things are better left undisturbed. I submitted my resignation from the National Park Service yesterday. My replacement will arrive next month, a young ranger fresh out of training who has no idea what he's walking into. I've decided not to brief him on the situation. He'll discover it for himself if he stays long enough. Part of me feels guilty about abandoning my post, about leaving the forest and its secrets unguarded, but I can't continue to carry this burden alone. The isolation, the constant fear, the weight of knowing something that no one else will believe, it's too much. I'm moving to a small town in Oregon, far from the mountains and the creatures that haunt them. I'll try to forget what I've seen, try to convince myself that it was all just stress and imagination. But late at night, when I hear branches scraping against my window, I know I'll always be listening for that familiar sound. The forest keeps its secrets, and sometimes those secrets are better left unknown. But I had to tell someone. I had to make this record, even if no one believes it, because somewhere in those mountains, in the deep wilderness where humans rarely go, something is waiting, something that has been watching us for longer than we know. And I have the terrible feeling that our time of ignorance is coming to an end.